Um, Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thanks for attending. It's a real pleasure to be here with the Pomona Student Union and to be with these wonderful speakers. I was just telling them right before we started how much I admire their work. You really have to have a passionate commitment to, preventing and fighting human trafficking, to really be working on this. These are very, very difficult topics to work on. Do you want to talk a little bit about the student union before we get started?
Yeah, sure, I can do that. So Pomona Student Union is a student-led organization on Pomona campus. We try to bring open and honest discussion on important issues. And so, yes, we planned this event, me and Alita. Unfortunately, she's not here, but Pomona Student Union, this is what we do. This is what we try to have people engage in these issues. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I have several students who are in the Pomona Student Union, and I'm already very proud of you and very proud of the fact that you wanted to invite me to moderate. So just to get started, just to give you an idea of who I am, I'm Esther Hernández-Medina. Esther, I'm from the Dominican Republic, and I'm a visiting assistant professor of sociology at Pomona College. I'm also a feminist activist. I'm part of the Dominican feminist movement, and I've also worked in government for many, many years back in the Dominican Republic. So I work in public policy. I'm also an activist, and I'm also a scholar. So basically, I get bored very easily, as you can see. And I have the privilege of
I think I relate to that.
Yeah, exactly. And then at the end of the week, you're like, and why am I so tired? And then you look at your calendar and it's like, oh, that's why. So again, it's a huge honor to be invited to be the moderator of this event, and especially to be part of this conversation that we're going to be having today about the very complex and unfortunately still very prevalent problem of human trafficking that we have in the US and that we have internationally. So let me introduce our wonderful speakers so that you have a clear idea of who are the authorities that we're going to be having a conversation with. We have Barbara Johnson from San Diego, California. She's the founder of Innocence Lost, and she started her education on this topic a number of years ago and was surprised to learn that it was so prevalent right here in San Diego and in the US, or originally thinking that it was only a problem in other countries. Once the truth of the extent of this modern day slavery was realized, she started her training to bring awareness to all who would hear. She is an ambassador of hope with Shared Hope International, has taken management training with FACES, a facility housing rescued children organization, spent time as a volunteer at Hidden Treasures Foundation, has taken training with the Department of Justice, and is currently a trained speaker for the Anti-Human Trafficking Community Committee in San Diego. And we also have today with us Ashlie Bryant. Ashlie is an innovator, leader, social entrepreneur, and advocate for children around the globe. She believes in the power of the human spirit and the ability for anyone to thrive and achieve. In 2010, Ashlie founded Strands Global Foundation in response to a trafficking incident in California. Over the past 12 years, she has led the organization to exponential growth. She was integral in the development of a global anti-trafficking training and curriculum, Protect, now live in 9 states and several countries. To date, the program has reached over 80,000 adults and more than 750,000 youth. Ashlie expanded Three Strands programming to include a direct services program called Employ Plus Empower. And this program has placed over 450 survivors and at-risk youth in sustainable jobs in the last 4 years in Sacramento and San Francisco, and is expanding to Texas this year. That's amazing. Ashlie holds a BA in International Relations and French from the University of California at Davis, finished the Nonprofit Leaders Program at Stanford University, was awarded the Public Leadership Credential at Harvard Kennedy School. That's something we have in common, Ashlie, the Kennedy School, and will finish her Master in Public Administration in 2022 this year from Cornell University. So thank you so much to both of you, Barbara and Ashlie, for joining us to talk about and to learn more about this very, very important topic. So I think, and basically what we're going to do is I'm going to ask you some questions that our colleagues at the Pomona Student Union have put together to get us started in the conversation. And then of course, we're going to also get questions from the audience. And the first question is, in your view, based on your experience, what are the details of the problem? How people are trafficked? What are the main trends? What are the main statistics? Where people are trafficked to? Who is usually targeted? Basically, what are the main dimensions of this very, very serious problem that we have? Barbara, can we start with you?
First of all, can I just say thank you, you guys, for coming. This typically people don't want to talk about this, because it's a taboo subject or it's bad or I can't do anything about it anyway. But we're here to tell you, you can do something about it. And if you see anything in this conversations that we're going to have that interests you, please get involved. Please do something, because that's what this is all about. That's what we did. We just got started because something happens and then you decide to do something about it. So this, for me, I basically most of mine is for California and San Diego, because this is such a huge topic. Bless you, Ashlie, for doing what you do. So I've kind of narrowed it down to where I feel like I can actually do something. And so in San Diego and in California, it's been horrible as far as social media. COVID kind of did a number on the kids. And so many people have been online and nobody's watching them. And then the next thing you know, Mr. Lover Guy is there to tell them how wonderful they are and touch everything they ever needed or wanted. And he's available to give it to them. So social media is just the big part of it right now. It can be familial. It can be family to family. Family members trafficking other family members. It's not so unusual nowadays. There are pimps who will promise you everything you ever thought of as far as the Hollywood contract or modeling. If someone is suggesting to you that and they came up to you and asked, do you want to be a model? I can do this for you. It's not real. That's not how modeling agencies connect with people. And then there's also labor trafficking. The numbers for labor trafficking are really rising up. And then there's, I personally myself have not seen much of this, but there is kidnapping. I've done this for 9 years or so. And in our area in California, there's not a lot. It does happen. Yes, it does happen. But it's not like the movie Taken. Let me say that. That's an exciting, fun movie because they win in the end. But here, and maybe Ashlie can speak on this, in other countries, that's probably more apparent. But that's not usually here. Usually here, she meets or he meets somebody online, and the next thing you know, they're meeting up somewhere, and it just goes on from there. But so that's, how about you, Ashlie? I mean, you can tell about worldwide.
Yeah, so I think thank you, Barbara. I think what I would just share with you all is I often start with this idea. If you imagine an umbrella for a second, and under this umbrella, there's two arms to the umbrella, and the umbrella is human trafficking. And the arms on the umbrella, one is commercial sexual exploitation, which we all call sex trafficking. And the other arm of the umbrella is labor trafficking or forced labor. And so with globally, we recognize really those two as the most that we have data on. That doesn't mean that there isn't a third around organ trafficking or forced marriage and some other things too. But really from a data perspective around the globe, as well as in the US, we focus in on forced labor and commercial sexual exploitation under the umbrella of human trafficking. The other piece that's super important for you all is that there are really three words that help us know if something's human trafficking or if it's not. and that's force, fraud, and coercion. And one of those things could be happening, and the other, and it doesn't mean you have to have all three, but if there's force, if there's fraud, or if there's coercion, then it falls into either commercial sex or forced labor, then that is a crime of human trafficking. So pornography also would fall within under that umbrella too. But I think that sort of just frames for us as we think about it. And I think the other piece of this is what Barbara shared is really true, that in the commercial sexual exploitation side across the United States, and most of the work that Strands Global Foundation does is in the US, and we have some work overseas, but most of it is in the US. But we are seeing a rise in familial trafficking. Over 50% of our cases in the United States are familial trafficking. The majority of those who are trafficked are Americans. Right? It's not people who are brought into this country, but it's actually Americans who are being trafficked in this country. We are, as we focus on those two parts of the umbrella, we are better at looking in the United States at commercial sex than we are forced labor. But I believe that forced labor will come along as not only the health department or Health and Human Services starts to do more data research in that space, as well as the State Department. But right now, that's we have a tendency to focus on sex trafficking. I will tell you that back in 2000, and you guys might know this, but in 2000s, when the TIP office was started at the State Department, it was a legislative act that actually came about. It was the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, TVP, and then there was no R back then, but it was the A. Now it's the TVP-RA, the Reauthorization Act. And that set a course for us as a country in the United States to track other countries and how and what trafficking is happening. And then in 2010, we added ourselves to that too. So we are now actually looking at that data to be able to see how well are we actually combating this crime in this country as well as overseas.
Thank you.
Jump in there with one more thing. Shared Hope. Thank you. Shared Hope International does a yearly kind of a study to see where the states are as far as trafficking goes. And I got to tell you, there's like, what is it, 40 states got an F. It goes from an A to an F. They got like 40 states have are doing horribly at this. Nobody got an A, nobody got a B, a couple of C's. I mean, this is where we are. I mean, that's why you guys are able to do something. Even if you don't want to speak on this, even if you don't want to, do what we're doing, there's a ton of ways to get involved. You can get involved in the legal side of it, which we totally need to have done. And you have this amazing teacher right here who can just school you along in how to do that kind of thing. So any place that you feel like you can get involved, I say, jump in. I didn't know what the heck I was doing when I started. I was a mother and a grandmother, and I thought I gotta do something about this. And you actually can. You can do something about it, but you got to start somewhere. So just jump in. I just want to say, jump in where you can.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I would add too, and that's so true, Barbara, is there are 4 different areas in the US and globally we focus in on. So prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnerships. So if there's an area within those 4, call them the 4 Ps in the US, if there's an area that's of interest to you, those are the 4 areas that we focus, right? So there are different things that fall within each of those Ps, but those are the 4 Ps. I'm happy to put them in the chat after too. That as a nation and as a globe, and as a UN, the UN has also focused in on those 4 Ps as we look at trafficking and how we combat it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I'm going to ask you both to share the websites in the chat for, the people who are already here, and other people are going to see this when it's posted on the YouTube channel. Before we move to talk more about the work that you do in the organizations themselves, I just want you to expand a little bit about the characteristics of the people who gets trafficked. Because I was actually surprised by what you just said, Ashlie, that most of them are actually people from the US. We usually have this idea of human trafficking being more, well, first of all, being more a problem overseas, but also being more a problem with people who are brought from overseas as well. Like even people in other countries, again, as I mentioned, I'm from the Dominican Republic, we tend to have this idea. So I'm going to ask you both to talk more about what you have found and what this data shows in terms of who are the people being trafficked.
Yeah, Barbara, you want me to start and then you want to jump in, or so think about when we think about someone who is going to be trafficked, whether forced labor or commercial sex, vulnerability is the most important thing that an exploiter or a trafficker is going to look for. So what makes us vulnerable? Now, I would contend that all of us could be vulnerable at one point in time in our lives for anything, right? I mean, we all are human, and there's lots of things that, I might wake up and feel lousy one day and someone comes to my door to sell me something and I just buy it because I want them to go away. And I was vulnerable to that, right? To that sale. But there are others in our country. And if we pause for a minute and we think about who is vulnerable in the United States, our youth are vulnerable, right? Because what is our youth looking for? They're looking for to be loved, accepted, for safety, right? The others who are vulnerable potentially are homeless, who are looking for money or for food and water and shelter. Our foster population, who, there's a combination of what I just mentioned that could make them vulnerable, but vulnerabilities are what traffickers and exploiters target. That is for them, and these are their words, that's the low-hanging fruit. So a crime can happen to anyone, anywhere in the United States, but they choose those most vulnerable because to them, again, to quote them, that's low-hanging fruit or the easiest to pick. So it's, how do I provide those things for someone who's vulnerable? How do I provide housing? How do I provide food or love or clothing, or even luxurious gifts to meet the vulnerability of that person, and then exploit them and traffic them in the process?
One of the things that I was really surprised to learn when I first started, one of the detectives was telling me that the traffickers know if they're out with a group, or there's kids out there, maybe there's a ton of them, they're just out having fun, and a trafficker will know and have a girl out of that group within 15 minutes because he spots her and knows her vulnerability. She's looking down, she's kind of alone by herself, even though she's with the group. She's feeling uncomfortable. She doesn't feel like she's that loved. They don't, maybe if you have, I said this to Tanya earlier, relationships with your dad are not good, but that's a tough one. We've got to get dads to stand up and do better about that. And if here's another one that surprised me, that so many kids are online with the games, which I forget what you call half of the games, but a lot of them are caught because someone's offering them gift games, right? So if somebody's offering you a gift and you don't know them, question that. I mean, that's not a typical thing, right? So you don't just take what that is. You got to know there's some reason behind what he's doing. But kids who have abusive history already, there's just the difference, and the traffickers can spot that in a flash, and then they'll have the girl out within 15 minutes. And let me just say, there's a lot of different kind of traffickers, but there's 3 basic kind of traffickers. And one would be the Romeo, and he's handsome and he's offering her everything she could ever want in her life. And it's me and you, babe, and your parents really don't know anything, but it's you and I, we're going to win the world. There's the guerrilla trafficker who's tough, and you don't want to be around this guy because he's not nice. And he takes them in through drugs, through violence. He's just a rough guy. And then the newest one that I had just learned about is a CEO trafficker, which we really didn't have a name for that before, but now it's the one who offers you business. I can get you a modeling job. I can help you make money in Hollywood. If people are coming up to you with that kind of process, you got to question that. And from a grandmother's side, if you feel that little funny, weird, something in your stomach, like what's going on, there's something going on, and you need to pay attention to that.
Yeah, no, that's true. We at Three Strands, we have a K-12 curriculum, and we call it the inner voice, right? Your inner watchdog. So if your inner watchdog is saying something and it's saying, I just don't feel good, or this feels uncomfortable, 100%, it usually is. The other thing I would mention is that when we think about vulnerability, and we think about what are the root causes that have made us vulnerable, right? So, is it that there's been abuse in the home, or that we haven't had the stability of guardians or caregivers in our lives? What are those root causes that then creates a higher vulnerability that then what Barbara was just talking about, through the process of a trafficker identifying that vulnerability and then grooming a person to actually then traffic, that the journey from root cause to vulnerability to grooming and then exploitation, right? That's sort of that trajectory.
Absolutely. What about, because I hear you both talking about vulnerability, but we also know, I mean, I'm a sociologist, so my mind goes directly to all the forms of structural inequality that we have in society, based on race, based on gender, based on sexual orientation, based on gender identity, based on class. So my question is, based on the data, based on what you've seen, how are those structural factors, those dimensions, play into this vulnerability? I mean, in terms of gender, we know that the majority are women or girls or people who identify as female, but is that the case, or is that just our perception? And what are the other features, like the other characteristics?
Our DA just, this one surprised me. Our DA just was talking to me the other day, and it's 50% boys now. And when I first started, I think it was like 20% boys. And that's just been in like an 8 or 9 year period that it's gotten to be that bad. It looks a little different, you know, with the boys. A lot of it is just taking pictures and then selling the pictures. There needs, if you're under 18, there needs to be some sort of exchange of something, money, phone, something, to call it trafficking. And I think it's like 7.4% of the LGBTQ, group are more likely to have some sort of a sexual violence thing happen. So for my experience has been, it's not so much about our society as much as it is, as Ashlie was saying, what's happening inside of them. The traffickers know how to pick those kids, without a doubt. And that happens to all people in all of our society. So for me, I'm seeing that it's just the vulnerable kid. It's not, and that vulnerable kid can come from the rich area, or they can come from the very poor area. And the same thing happens no matter what.
But you're right, Professor, that the majority of those trafficked in the United States are brown and black kids. They are. That is actually, the Polaris Project has talked about that. That, you know, and I think that to what Barbara said earlier about the taken is not what this is, super important for us to talk about myths and facts versus fiction. Because, you know, it's really important that we acknowledge the fact it can happen to a blonde, blue-eyed, white kid, but the majority of this happens to our brown and black children, both girls first and then our boys. And for that matter, not just our youth, right? I mean, and I'll talk about in a minute our program that we have, a survivor program and at risk, that is a jobs program. And we actually serve 16 to 60-year-old clients, right? Who have either experienced exploitation and or are at risk of exploitation and trafficking. So it is not just our young people too.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much.
And our transitional age youth, right? So those who just turned 18 to 23, right? Where AB 12 would help them in some way financially, but a trafficker savvy to the fact that now there's an adult, even though it may be a month or a day, right? It's all of a sudden an adult at 18.
Mm-hmm. And related to these trends that you've been speaking about, and you've already mentioned some of the things you do, can you say more about what both of the organizations do and other organizations that you're involved with, and what are the main problems in terms of policy? What are the things that are not being done that your organizations are trying to help with?
For me, one of the things that's the hardest to understand, and I'm in California, so I don't know what happens outside of California on this, but there is definitely not enough laws to help us with the buyers. There's not a huge consequence for the buyers. and a little slap on your hand, and maybe a class that you're going to take, but that's about it. So we need to change laws with that. I mean, because if there's no buyers, then there's no demand. So we can actually do something about that, but it takes people to change laws to be able to make that happen. And so far in California, we've not done a great job with that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Texas actually has the very first felony for buyers. So they actually now, last year, there were 5,000 arrested buyers in the state of Texas. So it's the very first one who has a felony for that. It's interesting because in California, we don't even have a serious felony. So we have different levels of felonies in California. And so it's, we have one level,
right.
2, and then 3. And so we don't even have it as a serious felony for a buyer or for a trafficker, for that matter. It's not a serious felony in California. But I think the other piece of this,
the nice thing about that is there's a new law that we're. Go ahead. You go ahead.
No, go ahead.
There's a new law where it's not in there yet. It's called SB 1042. And they are trying to make it now, it is a violent crime and it is a serious crime. Who knows why it would not be anyway, but we're hoping desperately that one is passed because it's so important, to have that happen. That's one of those that just makes me go, what are they thinking? When it's not a violent crime. Talk to any girl who's been in this and think that it's not a violent crime. Any boy who's been in this and say that it's not a violent crime. The nice thing about it, there's huge penalties that go with it, because my experience has been, say they finally get to court, the girl's scared to death. She won't testify against him. And the pimp's got all of these pimp friends in the court system in the back, and she has to look at all of them and then testify against him. Well, they're not going to do that for the most part. They're scared. There is a group called BACA that we have out here. It's a bunch of bikers that come dressed like bikers, and they sit in the courts and they sit in front of them, in front rows, and they say, you look at us instead of all the stuff that's going on behind. So they're trying, but we need to do so much more. So this law would be amazing if it passed. I would love to see it pass.
So one of the things that, if you think about policy, in the year 2000, we established the TIP office, right, at the State Department. In 2010, we were holding the United States accountable, and we established right around there the Office of Trafficking in Persons federally at the Department of Health and Human Services. After that happened, then states started to have their own sort of view on and how they're going to prosecute crimes, but they're also going to hold traffickers, buyers, as well as, at the time, because I've been doing this for 12 years, unfortunately, the victim even, they would actually arrest and put behind bars. So, if we look at policy now, there are many states. California was the first state. Three Strands wrote the legislation in 2017 called the Human Trafficking Prevention Education Act that was signed by Governor Brown. It was the very first in the United States prevention education bill that became law and went into effect in January 2018. And since, there are 6 states that have followed suit. So there is prevention education for students and teachers that have followed that. And federally, when we think about the federal State Department and Health and Human Services, the beautiful thing is that they're working together with the DOJ as well as the Department of Homeland Security to be able to figure out how we look at this crime holistically from a policy perspective. And what does education look like from a school perspective? What does health look like in hospitals from that perspective? What are corporations' responsibility for supply chains to be clean in and out of the United States as it relates to labor trafficking? And then each state has their own capacity to write legislation. We just finished working with Florida on fire inspectors and fire marshals being trained on human trafficking. So each state has the capacity to be able to do that so that the community can be educated and mandates can be set. Most mandates, unfortunately, are not funded. They're usually unfunded mandates, which makes it hard for those segments to be able to pay for that education. So for schools, right, they didn't have any funding that came along with it. However, right now, the only federal piece of legislation I will share with you is HR 6552. It's the Reauthorization Act. Representative Smith and Representative Bass have written it on the House side. And it actually addresses all the P's of our national as well as global focus. And it also puts funding in those P's as well, which is really great. So the first time funding came through the Trafficking in Persons Act was in 2017. And Three Strands actually got 4 of those federal grants for prevention education in 4 different states. So that was the very first time. And now it's circling back again for reauthorization for all 4 Ps to have some sort of funding for them as well. So the policy is a big piece of how we can change and move the needle for sure.
Those examples are fascinating. You just mentioned Ashlie working with the fire marshals. Can you, both of you, give us more examples of how this looks on the ground? Like when you work with communities, when you work with city governments, when you work with policymakers in both organizations, what are the kinds of things that the 2 of you do? Ashlie, we can start with you and then with Barbara.
Yeah, so I think for us at Three Strands, it's really important. There's 3 components to what we do, which is practice, policy, and research, right? At Three Strands, that is really what we focus in on. And around that are the partners that we work with. So whether that's government, whether that, it's the DA's office in across the US, or it is, our trafficking task forces, or it is corporations. Three Strands launched last year, actually today, the telecommunications, it's called TATE, Telecommunications Against Trafficking and Exploitation Initiative, where all the telecom folks can be trained across that segment of corporations through Three Strands Global Foundation. And then that's that legislation that we pushed through for the fire inspectors, the same type of thing, as well as the schools. So that bill that I talked about before. So we can really look at policy influencing those segments as we do our work, whether that be fire marshals, whether that be school boards, whether that be government or social services or law enforcement. All of those factors are people who need to be trained. And if we focus on who's the vulnerable population, then we know that all those who might come in contact with that vulnerable population are who we need to make aware about human trafficking. I think that that's probably the way we see it most.
Love that, because I'm the boots on the ground girl, so my experience has been tough. I would say tough. Everybody's busy, everybody's got their scheduling, everybody's got their plans already for the year, and then I come along, hey, let's do this. And it's tough. It's a lot of push, it's a lot of keep going. As an example, COVID really did a number on the abilities for our trafficking force. We have a task force down here. What the best policy would be to have a detective from every community on the task force. It's a 1-hour meeting, once a week. And I mean, you can't even it's difficult for them to even give up an hour of a meeting, even to just go, but to get them to be on the task force means that city has to pay for that guy, give him a salary, and he's not there. Well, out here, tons of the detectives are just leaving, or their jobs are terrible, or something happened and they're gone, and we do not have enough detectives to do that. And so it's a struggle to get that education going for everybody. The perfect thing would be for each detective, just be there for that 1 hour for the week. Everybody collectively knows what's going on, and it's so much easier to catch somebody, to take care of this. But it's really tough to have that happen. Recently, I started going into school board meetings because after talking with our DA, I realized there's no drug education program that needs to happen. And the fentanyl deaths this last year were 100,000. And if you were trafficked and had to sleep with somebody like 10 or 15 times a day, I would want to be on drugs myself, right? And so I thought, I'm going to jump in here and try to make this happen. Let's see what we can do and get this into the educational system. Well, the DA has a program. She set it out to the schools, and very few of the schools did it. And so I'm out there again, I'm knocking on the door. Here I am, let's do this thing together. And for me, it's been a push all the way. As far as governmentally, I was trained governmentally, thank goodness. They're good. And San Diego is working to make this thing happen. But it's been a tough push every single time for the most part. I've had to, I had one of the commanders of the task force said, Barb, you need to back up for a minute so we can, people are starting to get ticked because they don't want to hear about it. They're already busy. They've already got so much going on. But it takes people like Ashlie and I to just keep going. And some of you guys, if you feel any of this, contact us and let us help you get involved. Because that's what I did. The DA, I said, I have no idea what I'm doing. I just want to do something. And it started there.
Absolutely. Well, that's actually the last question I'm going to ask you before I open the Q&A. We already have a question in the chat. And both of you referred to this already. You gave some examples, but I do want to give you another opportunity to talk about what people can do, especially people who are not going to devote, their lives or their careers to this, but, as citizens, and in this case, especially as college students, what are some concrete things that we can all do to contribute to reduce and, eliminate this problem?
So I'm going to share my screen for a second, which is because super important right now. We always talk about what can I do in 10 seconds, 10 minutes, and 10 hours, right? At 3 Strands, what can we do? So this right here is if you hover your phone over that QR code, it'll put the human trafficking hotline in your phone. It'll bring it up. You can add it to your phone. So in 10 seconds, you can make sure that the human trafficking hotline is in your phone. And that way, if your inner voice says something that isn't right, you can actually call anonymously. It's anonymous, the human trafficking hotline, and let them know, hey, give them all the details of what you've seen. This is what I've seen. This seems really, it seems like it could be a trafficking case to me, and that the hotline will take that, and then they will forward it to the authorities or to the service provider that they think could actually help with the situation. If it is an emergency situation, then you call 911, right? But in case that it's not an emergency situation, but you just have a suspicion, then you can go ahead and get a hold of the National Trafficking Hotline. I think that's important. The other thing I'm going to have is this QR code, which is it is a PDF that has the definition, the signs, and how to report human trafficking cases. So again, in 10 seconds, you'll have both of these. Those are 2 things right off the bat that you guys can do and understand and know how to, what are those signs that we've talked about? What is the definition of human trafficking? How would I even know what to look for? And then how do I report? So those 2 are your first 10 seconds. The next thing I would say to you is, you guys already as student ambassadors with what you're doing in this program or in this club, have the voice to be able to lend to this, to combating human trafficking. And so whether it is that you find out what bills are at the Capitol, and that if you can have public comment, or you can have any type of information that you might even know more deeply, you could testify, right? There's lots of different ways to engage on the policy front. And then I would if home is California, I would look at some nonprofits within those P's that I talked about and figure out one area that seems like you'd be interested in, and then look for a nonprofit that focuses in on that P. For 3 Strands, it's prevention, and that's 100%, both through employment as well as education that we focus in on. That's our mission. That's what we don't, have mission creep. That's it. So if that's something that resonates with you, you can reach out to us at our 3 Strand site. But I think that that's would be my encouragement to you, is like in 10 seconds, you already did that. Now think about in 10 minutes after this is done, maybe it's a question you ask, and then in 10 hours later, what is it you're going to do then to be able to combat this crime?
One of the things I want to say about what Ashlie was talking about with the hotline number, it's been my experience as I do meetings, people are afraid to call the hotline number. I don't want to get involved, or maybe I'm wrong. And may I just say, can we just let the detectives do their job? They know how to tell who is. You don't have to worry about it. Like you said, you don't have to even give your name if you don't want to. But if you think something's happening, call the number. You could save somebody's life. And it's actually that simple. You may be the only one who said something. Here's an example. I was at one of the shopping centers here in town, and I was shopping, and I was with my grandkids, unfortunately. And well, I love my grandkids, but for this situation, it wasn't good. The girl is obviously something's not right. She's doesn't have enough clothes on for the time of year that it is. Okay, something's not right. But I have my little grandkids with me, so I had to let it go. Next time I go to the shopping center, there she is again. And so when I went home, I'm starting to walk through this thing, and I realized she's on the missing persons page, and she's from Arizona. So one phone call can save that person. Just, you think you may be doing nothing, but one phone call could be the very thing that changes that girl's life. I forgot. Oh, the other things, what you can do is, the worst thing you can do is nothing. You can tell your neighbors, you can tell your friends just what you're learning today. Do something, tell them anything that you've learned. And if you find that you're interested more, find out, learn. I went to just training for a year. I just went to every meeting that I could find. I watched movies, I did documentaries, I did everything I possibly could with the time frame that I had, just to see what the heck is up with all of this. And boy, did I find out. And that's why I ended up eventually starting my own nonprofit, because you just, after finding out how this is and how bad it is, it's hard to take a step back and do nothing about it. But you may not want to do what we do. You could just keep doing some training, you could learn more. And may I say, just don't ever stop fighting. We need to not stop fighting in this issue. You guys can do something. If you don't know what to do, you call me or Ashlie. Get on our websites. You can do that, and we can help you move forward on it. But we are asking you to do your part. That's all. At least tell your friends. But the worst thing you can do, like I said, is nothing, because this needs to be taken care of.
Absolutely.
Sorry about my passion there. I can't stop.
No. That's exactly what we need. That's exactly what we need, Barbara. And in fact, I was telling you before we started the event that we were having a similar conversation in my class just before this, the importance of being allies, the importance of showing up when the person or the group that is in the most disadvantaged situation cannot do anything, or is just, they're tired. In this case, it's even worse. This are levels of vulnerability that are much higher, and we need to intervene. And again, I like what both of you said. We're not asking people to become advocates as well. We're not asking people to make this their life's work, which is the case of both of you, but there are many things that we can all do. So I do have a question in the chat already. Zia, do you want to read it yourself? And if anybody has other questions that have already sent to the organizers, or if you want to put them in the general chat, please go ahead and we will call on you shortly. Ziad.
Yes, thank you, Profe. Hello. Thank you so much for this, by the way. It was really informative and I really appreciate it. And I love the passion you shared. My name is Ziad Sabai, and pretty much I took a comparative politics class that taught us that it was difficult to compare countries and their governance units due to varying domestic politics. So what is your method when comparing sex trafficking handling here to other countries with varying structural determinants?
A great question. So I will tell you from my own experience, having spent time overseas in different countries to look at what trafficking looks like in other countries, you're 100% right. It is different, right? There are some things that are similar, but because governments and corruption in some countries are different than they are in our own country, we have to be able to look at it, even here in the United States, state by state. But I will give you an example of Cambodia. There, as I had my boots on the ground and working there, that commercial sexual exploitation is far greater. And usually they're very young, or their victims are anywhere from 8 years old, 8 or 9 is the average age overseas. So it's important for us to recognize culturally and sensitively what's happening in a country different than it is in perhaps the country that we reside in ourselves. And it is also really important, above all else, to be able to draw on lived experience from those who live in the country and who are natives, and or those who have been experienced either commercial sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, or labor trafficking. Our lived experience experts, no matter what country they're in, will help guide us in the effort to actually combat this crime most effectively. And so it's really important as we do this work that they lead the way, their voices lead the way, because that really helps, to your question, to us to be able to be sensitive and to be culturally competent as we address a crime in different countries.
Thank you so much.
I agree with everything Ashlie says, and bless you, girl, for being there, because it is so different in each country. And for me, this is such a huge problem that my focus is more here, so that I can actually feel like I'm doing something. The first time I turned in a pimp and he actually went to jail, I got to tell you, that was exciting, and it makes you just want to keep going. You know, after you see maybe you've saved somebody's life, or a couple of girls, or 5 girls, or whatever. Just because, you know, you actually do something, and it keeps me going when I know that I've stepped into something and it's a good thing to step into.
Well, and I think that on that, you know, I think one of the things that, so one of the things it's super important for us to recognize and realize that those who are traffickers or exploiters need to be held accountable for what they have done. And I will tell you that I spent 2 years interviewing 65 traffickers, or those who experienced trafficking in prison. And a lot of parallels happen in the beginning years for those traffickers as the victims or survivors later on, right? So it's important for us, as we look at this crime and we think holistically, how do we combat it? We hold accountable those who have done something and the consequences for those who have done something. However, it's also really important for us, as those who are part of looking at holistically, how do we do this, to say what are the root causes, both for trafficker, exploiter, and buyer, that need to be addressed equally as someone who potentially would be a victim or a survivor of this crime. Because root causes across all of those are going to happen, right? And of the 65 that I spent time interviewing, 99% of those had root causes very similar to those thousands, about 10,000s of survivors I've talked to over the last 12 years. And that doesn't minimize or make me less frustrated or angry about what's happened to a survivor and the story, but it also is really important in us solving the problem, is to be able to really address the root causes.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're making a connection, Ashlie, both of you are, with what I was saying earlier about structural factors, right? Does that mean, when you mentioned parallels just now, Ashlie, that many of those traffickers had been trafficked themselves as well?
Yeah, so in that group, whether they were traffickers, they had been trafficked, their extended family were traffickers, there was domestic violence or abuse or addiction, right? All of those things that I would see as root causes that then would lead to trafficking. So the gateway to trafficking as a trafficker could, you know, the person down the street who becomes a trafficker and the other is the victim or survivor, right? They came from the community, same community. Root causes were the same, potentially, but one became trafficker and the other became victim and then survivor. So, you know, I think that it's really, as we look at, you know, when I think about wicked problems in the world, and specifically in the US, where 3 Strands does most of our work, it's really important to think as systems thinkers, right? How do we think about, as systems thinkers, this wicked problem, and how do we break it down? How do we distinguish one thing from another? How do we look at the system and the relationships between them? And then how do we look at perspectives and different perspectives? Because if we look at things that way, then we'll truly look at then we can look at how we actually solve a wicked problem. But if we just look at it as black and white, we're not going to get there fast.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, that is why it's so important to, as you just mentioned, to look at the structural factors and the context in these situations. And it just struck me that what you both described is very similar to what my friends and, you know, feminist colleagues who work on violence against women, for instance, talk about. Like, some of the patterns are very similar. We
Yeah.
have another question in the chat, and I asked Elise to share it with us. Elise, can you go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. So I was looking on the websites and I found this petition on the Shared Hope International website. And it says that tragically 19 states in the nation can still arrest and charge youth survivors of sex trafficking with the crime of prostitution, the very crime committed against them. So I was wondering, I guess, what is this petition working towards? Are there sort of laws or policies that we are working towards, or yeah, just if you could talk a little more about that.
Yeah, I mean, Barbara, you probably, the 19 states that arrest victims for prostitution. Let me actually share a story, because I was actually going to just share this, and it's actually perfect timing. So this question is great, Elise. In our employment programs called Employ Plus Empower, we've served 445 survivors since 2016 and at-risk individuals we've placed into sustainable jobs. There is a preponderance of those who have prostitution on their record, right? Because they've been arrested in their time of being in the life, which is what it's called for the commercial sexual exploitation or sex trafficking. They were arrested for prostitution. Now that could have been because before there was the laws in California that we've passed, but those 19 states that you just mentioned have laws still where victims are arrested as prostitutes or because they've been prostituted, and that's now on their record. And so what Shared Hope is asking is to help to petition those 19 states to make sure that we decriminalize, is what it's called, victims of human trafficking. So they will not have a record of prostitution if they're arrested, if they are a victim of human trafficking. And the person who I was going to tell you the story is one of our clients who was being exploited commercially and sexually, had a record of prostitution, and was finding a hard time to find a job, right? The reality is finding a job when you have a record of prostitution is not the easiest thing. And so very discouraged, very frustrated that people were closing the door, and found the 3 Strands program and got into that employee program. And not only did we help expunge that from the record, but we also found a job, and that individual is now thriving, that client's thriving. So, but it is real that states have that as a crime, and it can be on someone's record.
Perfect.
One of the things that I'm loving about California is a lot of the attorneys out here are doing pro bono work to do that very thing. She's trying desperately to work somewhere and she can't. And so there's a number of attorneys now who are willing to step in there for the battle and make it happen.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I also like the example you gave of the bikers in the court supporting the victims. We have a last question. I want to be, cognizant of time because our time is almost up. This last question, I'm going to give Katiana the next turn, and I want to combine it. I mean, it's implicit in her question with the question I had about best practices. So Katiana is also asking about that so that we can end on a positive note. So things that have been happening and that are being done by authorities to, eliminate this problem. Katiana, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I can go. So I was kind of looking around at that report card for the state of for all the states in the US, and looking at like their grades, and I thought it was interesting to kind of see like where they rank, and then also a little bit sad to see that there are only 2 C's. But I was kind of curious what you guys think, on some level, like makes these states different, or why, what prompted these changes that resulted in like that higher grade. and that work towards something that is, better than a, C is passing. So, like kind of
40 states that got an F, right? In our state, our DA is amazing. She does whatever she can to push forward on this topic. She does this for the person who's hurt, the person who needs help. And she will push and push and push. She's got a little thing on her desk and says she has a fire in her heart and grace in her soul or something like that. And that is totally her. She just is at it and keeps at it. And it takes that, I think, to make that kind of change, is depending on who's in your government and who are you voting for. And that's why we need to know who we are voting for so that we can end up with the results that we'd like to have.
Yeah, I think so. It's a good question. So I think sort of thinking about best practices as well as grades for states, I think that in 2010-ish, I think is where were added to be able to be held accountable. And I think we've made a lot of progress, right, in the last 12 years. Terminology has changed in the last 12 years. What we would have said 12 years ago has now different best practices, is to be able to truly go to lived experience experts first and figure out what is the very best way that as consultants they can navigate this issue in the United States. So that's a best practice that wasn't here 12 years ago for sure. And I think that even though survivors were a part of the conversation, they weren't paid part of the conversation, which they should have been early on and the whole time. And so now they are. That's also part of what's best practice. I would tell you that within those 4 Ps, if a state has a higher, better grade, then more than likely, Katiana, it is because they are doing something within those 4 Ps that shows whether it's legislation within the protection piece or the prevention piece or the partnership or the prosecution, right? Those are those 4 Ps. So within those 4 Ps, they're doing something that gives them that higher grade. So for example, in education, California has our law, right? So that would bump us up a little bit because of that. The decriminalization of victims would help us in California to be able to say that that's a positive thing versus other states. But there are specific elements within those 4 Ps that are looked at to be able to say where is the state fall. And I actually think that they break it down in that report card on what they're rating if you look deeper, and you'll be able to see one versus the other. What does that really look like in real life? I would tell you that within the prevention space, when it comes to schools, early on in 2010, we started with best practice starts with a protocol, right? You don't go into a school and do education unless your teachers understand what they should do if they identify someone. Because if they are trained, but they don't know what to do, then that child has the opportunity to fall through the cracks, right? And we don't want that. So best practice when it comes to prevention education is that there's a protocol, there's training, there's curriculum, and then there's research, right? So that's just in the prevention space. But every single P has best practices with policy sort of all the way around it to be able to know that we are effectively and efficiently combating this crime. And the last thing I would say is that Summer Steffen, who's the DA that Barbara's mentioned over again, she is in the United States very much, along with Nancy O'Malley and Alameda, someone who has for a long time, 20 plus years, been in this movement. And I think California has led the way very much so in different legislative acts, as well as innovative ways that we can combat this crime.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to both Barbara and Ashlie for this amazing conversation. I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure that everybody here has as well. And of course, once this is posted on the YouTube channel, more people are going to have the opportunity to learn about this. And I'm very grateful to both of you because both of you shared very concrete, easy ways to be a citizen, to be a responsible citizen, to be someone who can also contribute to eliminate this problem. Thanks again to the Pomona Student Union for organizing this. Thanks again to our audience and for all the amazing questions that the students had. And I'm just going to pass it to Tanya to close the event as one of the organizers from the Pomona Student Union. Thank you again, everybody, so much.
Yes, thank you very much. This was very informative. I think everyone will come out of this meeting with knowing something new about this topic that's very taboo, and people think it has nothing to do with them. But thank you very much for sharing this with us. If you want to watch it again, or if you know anyone else who's interested but couldn't make it, the event is recorded and it will be on our YouTube channel, which I posted in the chat. And we will also post something like a small post of a summary of what we discussed here. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you so much. I hope you all have a beautiful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.